A billionaire walked into his grandson's first birthday party. He took one look at the old mechanic standing by the drink table and collapsed on the floor. Paramedics called it a heart attack. But his son knew better. Because 18 years earlier, his father had destroyed that man's life and buried the proof so deep, he thought no one would ever find it. Stay to the end, because the truth doesn't just come out. Comes back. For 5 years, Richard Hale mocked his son for marrying a waitress. He called her family nobodies. He refused to meet them. He skipped the wedding. He cut off his son's trust fund. He told his friends at the country club that Derek Hale had thrown his life away for a girl named Maya Brooks who served him coffee at a diner on First Street. Richard Hale was worth $4.2 billion in 2026. He owned Hale Dynamics, the defense contractor that built half the drones in the Nevada testing range. He had a mansion in Palo Alto, a private jet, and a seat on 3 boards. And he had one rule: no one from the wrong side of the tracks gets into the family. So when Derek called in 2021 and said he was marrying Maya, Richard hung up. When the invitation came, he sent it back unopened. When his first grandson was born in 2023, he sent a check with no note. And when Maya called him in 2024 and said Derek was in the hospital after a car accident, and she needed him to sign medical forms because Derek was unconscious, Richard sent his lawyer instead. That was the last time anyone in the Brooks family tried to contact Richard Hale. Until March 15, 2026. Noah's first birthday. That was Noah's first birthday. Noah Hale, Richard's only grandchild. Derek was out of the hospital, walking with a cane, back at work coding for a startup because his father had blacklisted him from every major tech firm in the state. Maya was working nights at the hospital as an RN and days watching Noah. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Fremont. They didn't have money for a party. So Maya's father, Thomas Brooks, said he'd pay for a small gathering at the community center. He was a retired mechanic. He lived on Social Security and fixed cars for cash on weekends. He'd raised Maya alone after her mother died in 2008. Derek had met Thomas twice, briefly at the hospital and at the courthouse when he and Maya got married. Derek liked him. He was quiet. He had grease under his fingernails, and he called Derek son. Richard had never even asked his name. On March 15th, Derek texted a photo to his father. It was Noah with a smashed cake on his face. No caption, just the photo. Richard stared at it for 12 minutes. Then he got in his car and drove to Fremont. He didn't call. He didn't tell his assistant. He told himself he was just going to see the boy. He wasn't going to speak to Maya. He wasn't going to stay. He walked into the community center at 3:17 p.m. There were 12 people there. Balloons. A sheet cake from Costco. A few folding tables. Someone's kids running between the chairs. Derek saw him first. He froze. Maya was holding Noah. She turned. Her face went white. The room went quiet, one voice at a time, the way a room does when something is wrong before anyone says why. Richard walked past his son. Past his grandson. He was looking at the man standing by the drink table. A man in a clean button-down shirt. 67 years old. Gray hair. Hands folded. Holding a cup of punch. Thomas Brooks. Richard Hale took one more step. Then his knees buckled. He hit the tile floor. The 911 call was placed at 3:18 p.m. Paramedics said it was a cardiac event. But Derek knew it wasn't, because he saw his father's face right before he fell. It wasn't pain. It was recognition. And it was fear. If you're the kind of person who needs to know how this ends, and trust me, it gets so much worse for Richard Hale before it gets better for everyone else, do 2 things right now. Hit subscribe so this channel keeps showing up in your feed, and drop a comment telling us who you think Thomas Brooks really is. We read everyone, and some of you are going to call this before we even get there. Now back to the story. Richard woke up in the ICU 6 hours later. His lawyer was there. His doctor was there. Derek was there. Richard looked at Derek and said one sentence. "Where is he?" Derek said, "Who?" Richard said, "Thomas Brooks." Derek said, "He's my father-in-law. He's in the waiting room with Maya." Richard closed his eyes. "I need you to get him out of this hospital." Derek said, Why? Richard didn't answer. He asked for his lawyer. For the next 2 days, Richard refused to see anyone but his legal team. Maya and Thomas went home. Derek stayed, sleeping in a chair, watching his father through the glass, trying to understand what he'd just seen. On day 3, Richard asked Derek to sit down. He said, "What do you know about your wife's father?" Derek said, "He's a mechanic. He raised Maya alone. He's a good man." Richard said, "Did he ever go to prison?" Derek said, "No. Why would you ask that?" Richard was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "In 1997, Hale Dynamics was about to collapse. We had a government contract we couldn't deliver. One of my engineers, a man named Thomas Brooks, found a way to falsify the test results. He came to me. He said we could ship the units and no one would know. I said no. He did it anyway. When the Department of Defense audited us, I gave them his name. I gave them his files. I gave them his access logs. He was arrested. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 15 years. I testified against him. The company survived. I became a billionaire. I never saw him again. I was told he died in prison in 2004. Derek stared at his father. Maya's dad was released in 2012. He was exonerated in 2014. The real test logs were found. Someone else at Hale Dynamics had framed him. The governor pardoned him. He got a settlement. He moved to Fremont. He changed his name back to Brooks, his real name. He never told Maya because she was 12 when he went in, and he didn't want her to see him like that. Richard said nothing. Derek said, "You buried an innocent man to save yourself, and now he's my daughter's grandfather." Richard said, "I didn't know." Derek said, "You didn't ask." While Richard sat in his hospital bed rebuilding a memory he'd spent decades trying to forget, Maya was sitting in her father's kitchen in Fremont, asking him a question she'd never had the courage to ask before. "Dad," she said, "who is Richard Hale to you?" Thomas Brooks set down his coffee. He looked at his daughter for a long moment, the way a man looks at someone when he's deciding whether 30 years of silence is worth breaking. "He's the man who put me in prison," Thomas said. Maya sat down slowly. "You worked for him. I worked for Hale Dynamics for 11 years. I was one of their best engineers. In 1997, I found out our division was about to ship defective components on a military contract. I told my supervisor. Nothing happened. I told the COO. Nothing happened. Then, 3 weeks later, federal auditors showed up, and somehow my name was on every falsified document in the building." "Did you do it?" "No," Thomas said. "But it didn't matter. Richard Hale needed someone's name on those papers, and mine was the one that made the least noise. I had no money for a real defense. I had a public defender who'd never touched a case like it. I went in when you were 12 years old. I told the prison I had died on paper so you'd never come looking for me there. Your mother had already passed. I didn't want the last memory you had of me to be through a visitation window." Maya was crying by the time he finished. "Why didn't you ever tell me? Time I got out, you'd built a life without me having to be a part of the ugly parts of it. I came back into your world when you were 22, and I told you I'd been working out of state. You never asked more and I never offered more. I didn't want you to marry into a family and immediately feel like you owed me a war against your father-in-law. Did you know Derek's father was the same Richard Hale? Before the wedding? I knew the moment you told me his last name," Thomas said. "I sat with it for a week before your wedding day. I decided that hating him wasn't worth losing you over. I decided I would rather watch my grandson grow up than spend what's left of my life proving a point to a man who already knew what he did." Maya reached across the table and took her father's hand. "You've been carrying this alone for 30 years. I've been carrying it," Thomas said, "so you wouldn't have to." That night, alone in his hospital bed, Richard let himself remember 1997 the way it had actually happened, not the way he'd rewritten it in his head for 20 years. He remembered the government auditors sitting across from him in the conference room on the 14th floor. He remembered the silence after they asked whose signature was on the falsified test logs. He remembered his COO, Peter Klein, sliding a folder across the table before the meeting. A folder with Thomas Brooks's name already typed onto every document. He remembered telling himself it wasn't a lie. Exactly. Someone had to take the fall. The company employed 4,000 people. Thomas Brooks was one engineer. The math in Richard's mind at the time had been simple. He remembered not asking a single question before he handed the folder over. He remembered how easy it had been to sleep that night, and every night after, for almost 30 years, until a photograph of a birthday cake landed on his phone and put him in a room with the man whose life he'd traded for his own. The next morning, Richard discharged himself from the hospital. He went home. He didn't call Derek. He didn't call Maya. He called his lawyer. He said, "Find out everything about the 1997 case. Find out who really falsified the logs." His lawyer asked why, after almost 30 years, this mattered now. Richard said, "Because I saw the man's face. He recognized me before I recognized him. He's known this whole time, and he never said a word to my son. He never said a word to my grandson. He let them love him instead of hating me. I need to know exactly what I did to him." 2 weeks later, the lawyer came back. The logs, in 1997, had been falsified by Richard's then COO, a man named Peter Klein. Klein had died in 2010. But in 2009, he'd given a deposition in an unrelated civil case, buried in a filing cabinet in a courthouse basement, that no one at Hale Dynamics had ever bothered to dig up. Hale had told him to change the test results and, in his words, make sure Brooks is the only name on those files if the audit ever came. Richard's lawyer played the tape. Richard sat in his study and listened to his own voice from 29 years earlier, calm and certain, telling a man to destroy someone else's life to save his own. He fired his lawyer that same afternoon. Not because the lawyer had done anything wrong. Because Richard couldn't stand to have another person in the room who now knew what he knew. Richard called Derek. He said, "I need to see him." Derek said, "No." Richard said, "I need to tell him I'm sorry." Derek said, "You can't. He doesn't want to see you. Maya doesn't want to see you. I don't want to see you." Richard said, "Then I'll go to the press." Derek said, "And say what?" Richard said, "The truth." Derek said, "The truth is you're a criminal. And if you confess, Hale Dynamics collapses. The stock crashes. 20,000 people lose their jobs. The government cancels the contracts. Your grandson's college fund disappears. My job disappears. Maya's hospital loses funding. Is that what you want?" Richard was silent. Derek said, "You made your choice in 1997. You made it again in 2021 when you disowned me. You don't get to make it now." Richard hung up. For 6 months, nothing happened. Richard went back to running Hale Dynamics, sat through board meetings, signed contracts, gave a keynote at a defense industry conference in Austin. From the outside, nothing had changed. But people who worked closely with him noticed something different. He stopped taking credit in meetings. He started asking junior engineers their names. He quietly authorized a settlement for a supplier dispute he would have fought for years in a courtroom 5 years earlier. None of it made the news. None of it undid anything. It was just a man trying to prove something to himself in rooms no one was watching. At night, in the Palo Alto house, Richard ate dinner alone at a table built for 12. He kept the photo Derek had sent him, Noah with cake smeared across his face, printed and framed on his desk, next to a stack of legal files he couldn't bring himself to open. His assistant of 14 years quietly resigned in June. She didn't give a reason. Richard didn't ask for one. He suspected she already knew what he'd done, the way people close to power always seem to know before it becomes official. He hired a private investigator, off the books, to find out what had happened to Thomas Brooks in the years between his release and his arrival in Fremont. The report came back thin. A halfway house in Sacramento, 2 years working an auto shop under a different name. A small settlement from the state that barely covered a used truck and a security deposit. No therapy, no support group, no lawsuit against Hale Dynamics, even though Thomas would have had every right to file one. Richard asked his investigator why a man with a legitimate claim against a multibillion-dollar company had never once tried to collect. The investigator said, "From what I can tell, sir, he didn't want your money. He just wanted to be left alone to raise his daughter." Richard didn't sleep that night. Meanwhile, in Fremont, Derek and Maya were having their own quiet argument, one that had been circling for weeks without either of them saying it directly. "He's going to try to fix this the way he fixes everything," Derek said one night after Noah was asleep. "With money or with control. He's going to try to make this go away quietly, and if we let him, my dad gets to keep being the man who tragically fainted at a party." "Your dad doesn't get anything." "I don't know yet, but I know I'm not protecting him anymore. I spent 5 years making excuses for why he skipped the wedding, why he sent a check instead of showing up when Noah was born. I'm done deciding his silence is somehow my job to manage." "If this comes out," Maya said, "it doesn't just hurt him. It hurts you. Your job. Us." "I know," Derek said, "but my dad taught me that some things are worth protecting even when they cost you something. He just taught me by doing the opposite. Your dad is the one who actually showed me what he meant." Maya set the laundry down. "Then we let the truth decide what it wants to do. We don't chase it. We don't bury it. We just stop protecting the man who spent his whole life burying things for other people to deal with." Neither of them made a phone call that night. But 3 weeks later, a manila envelope containing a 20-year-old deposition transcript found its way to a national reporter's inbox, and no one, not Derek, not Maya, not Thomas, ever said out loud how it got there. Then, in October 2026, the Department of Justice announced it was reopening the 1997 Hale Dynamics case. An anonymous source had delivered the original Peter Klein deposition to a reporter at a national outlet. The source was never named. The stock dropped 40% in one day. The board called an emergency session. Reporters camped outside the Palo Alto house. The board forced Richard to resign within the week. The DOJ offered him a deal: testify fully, return the bonuses tied to the falsified contract, and avoid prison time. Richard took it. He testified for 3 days. On the first day, he walked the court through the 1997 contract, the failed tests, the audit that was 3 weeks from finding the truth on its own. He said Peter Klein's name out loud, in full, for the first time in almost 30 years. On the second day, the prosecution played the 2009 deposition tape for the courtroom. Richard sat and listened to his own voice again, this time with reporters in the gallery writing down every word. He didn't ask them to stop the recording. He didn't object. His new lawyer, a man he'd hired specifically because she told him she wouldn't help him minimize anything, said nothing either. On the third day, the judge asked him directly, "Mr. Hale, did you know Thomas Brooks was innocent when you gave the Department of Defense his name?" Richard said, "I didn't ask, and not asking was its own kind of knowing. Thomas Brooks's name." He said, "I was responsible." Thomas Brooks was in the courtroom for all 3 days. He sat behind Maya, in a gray jacket he'd owned for over a decade, hands folded in his lap, the same way they'd been folded around a cup of punch a year earlier. He never looked at Richard, not during the testimony, not during the tape, not when the judge asked if anyone in the gallery wished to make a statement before sentencing recommendations were filed. When it was over, Richard walked out of the courthouse into a wall of cameras. Reporters shouted questions over each other. One voice cut through. Did he have anything to say to Thomas Brooks? Richard stopped on the courthouse steps. The cameras kept rolling. He said, "I saw him at my grandson's birthday. I fainted because I knew I'd destroyed his life. I fainted because I knew his daughter married my son. I fainted because I knew God had a way of putting the truth in the room whether you want it there or not." A reporter asked if he had anything to say directly to Derek and Maya. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No. I already said everything I needed to say to them 29 years ago, when I decided whose name went on those papers instead of mine. They heard me loud and clear. It just took me this long to hear myself." Thomas Brooks never gave a statement, on the courthouse steps or anywhere else. He walked to his truck, drove home to Fremont, and went back to work in his garage the next morning, the same as he had every Saturday for over a decade. Maya and Derek never spoke to Richard again. 3 years later, Noah is 3 now. He has a photo on his wall of his first birthday. In the photo, you can see Richard Hale in the doorway. And behind him, out of focus, is Thomas Brooks holding a cup of punch. Hale Dynamics was sold in 2027. Richard lives alone in the Palo Alto house. He is not allowed on company property. He sends a check to Noah every month. The checks come back unopened. Thomas Brooks still fixes cars on weekends. He still calls Derek son. He still doesn't talk about 1997. On Noah's 3rd birthday, there was another party. Again at the community center. Again with balloons and a cake that wasn't from a fancy bakery. Thomas stood by the same drink table. Derek watched him for a moment and thought about the last time his father had walked through that door. "You ever think about inviting him?" Derek asked quietly, refilling a cup of punch beside his father-in-law. "Just to see the boy, not to talk. Just to see him." Thomas considered it the way he considered most things, slowly, without performance. "I forgave him a long time ago," he said. "Long before that first birthday. I had to, or it would have eaten me alive in that cell. But forgiving a man and wanting him in the room with my grandson are 2 different things. I don't owe him the second one just because I found a way to survive the first." Derek nodded. He didn't push it further. Some silences he'd learned were their own kind of answer. Across the bay, in the house built for 12, Richard Hale set a small gift-wrapped box on the entry table, the way he did every year now. Inside was a toy he'd picked out himself, something he'd actually walked into a store to choose instead of having an assistant order it. He knew it would never be opened. He wrapped it anyway. Some men, he'd learned far too late, keep showing up not because it changes anything, but because it's the only apology they have left to give. Because some men build billions by burying the truth. And some men bury the past by building a family. And sometimes the 2 men end up in the same room. And when they do, one of them hits the floor. One more thing the private investigator found. Remember Richard said Thomas was crazy and obsessed? He was wrong. But Thomas was obsessed with something. Not with Richard. With Maya. The investigator found Thomas's journal. He'd been watching Maya grow up from a distance for 2 years after his release. Copying down her school schedules. Her report cards. Her first job applications. He didn't want Richard's money. He wanted to be in Maya's life. He thought if he stayed quiet, if he never made trouble, he'd get to see his daughter graduate. He'd get to walk her down the aisle. That's why he never sued Hale Dynamics. That's why he never told Maya the truth. But he picked the wrong family to marry into, and the wrong man to cross in 1997. When Richard collapsed at that party, it wasn't just guilt. It was the realization that the man he destroyed had raised the woman his son loved. And now that man was all Derek had left. Permanently, because that's the part Richard never said out loud in court. He didn't just destroy Thomas Brooks in 1997. He destroyed Derek's future father-in-law before Derek ever met Maya. He took away the man who would have taught Derek how to fix a sink, how to change oil, how to be a father when your own father won't show up. Thomas Brooks got that chance anyway, not because Richard allowed it, but because Thomas refused to let Richard take it from him twice. And that's why, when Richard walked into that community center and saw Thomas standing by the drink table, he didn't just see a ghost from his past. He saw the man who had won, without money, without lawyers, without revenge, just by showing up. Every weekend, every birthday, every night Maya called him crying. Richard had $4.2 billion. Thomas had a cup of punch and a grandson who called him Papa. And in that moment, Richard knew which one was richer. The checks Richard sends every month aren't for Noah. Richard knows that. They're for him. Because it's the only way he can pretend he's still part of the story. But he's not. The story moved on without him. It moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in Fremont. It moved to a community center with folding tables. It moved to a garage where a grandfather teaches his grandson how to hold a wrench. Richard's house is empty. Thomas's garage is full. And that's the difference between a man who builds companies and a man who builds a family. One leaves behind stock options. The other leaves behind people who answer the phone when he calls. Richard calls sometimes. No one answers. Not Derek. Not Maya. Not Thomas. But he keeps calling. Because some men, when they finally understand what they've lost, can't stop dialing the number even though they know it won't ring. Noah doesn't know who Richard Hale is. Not really. He knows there's a man in a big house who sends toys. But he thinks Papa is the man who fixed his tricycle. Family is the man who brings him to the park on Saturdays. He thinks Rich is the man who lets him eat ice cream before dinner when Mom isn't looking. And he's right, because Thomas Brooks may have spent 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. But he spent the next 15 years making sure his grandson never spent a day feeling like he wasn't wanted. Richard spent 15 years building Hale Dynamics. He spent the next 15 years making sure his son knew he was a disappointment. One man got out of prison and built a life. The other man built a prison and called it a mansion. And now, every night, one of them sleeps in a house that feels like home. And the other one sleeps in a house that feels like a courtroom where the trial never ends. If you ask Derek who his real father is now, he won't say Richard's name. He'll say, "The man who taught me how to be a dad when mine wouldn't teach me how to be a son." If you ask Maya who saved her life, she won't say her husband. She'll say, "My dad," twice. Once when he went to prison so I wouldn't have to see him in a cage. And once when he came back and never made me pay for it. And if you ask Thomas what he'd do differently, he'll say, "Nothing. Because if I'd done one thing different, I might not be standing here watching my grandson blow out candles. And that's the only math that matters to me now." Richard doesn't get asked questions anymore. Not by reporters. Not by his son. Not by himself. Because he already knows the answer. He was asked, once, in 1997, "Whose name goes on these papers?" And the answer he gave that day is the reason he eats dinner alone now. The answer he didn't give is the reason Thomas Brooks gets to eat dinner with his family. If a man ever tells you your family isn't good enough, remember Thomas Brooks. If a man ever tells you to be quiet so he can stay comfortable, remember Maya. If a man ever tells you that money is the same thing as worth, remember Noah. And if you ever think it's too late to tell the truth, remember Richard Hale. Because the truth came back for him anyway. He came back in a community center. Came back holding a cup of punch. Came back wearing a clean button-down shirt. And it didn't say a word. It just stood there and waited for him to fall.